maybe about resolutions and anticipated futures. So I have to say that one of my own distinct memories of that conference, as well as that jousting, as actually Richard Varden put it, between the Sir Raymond and Sir Edmund, one of my memories is one that I've repeated in this conference, and I expect that many of you have, which is trying to get from one part of the campus to another. I'm pretty much sure that the same building work is still going on. But I especially recall one moment when a group of us kind of pottered along, only to realise that what we'd done was followed Ronnie Frankenberg, who's another ASA stalwart of the time, into an area for the storage of rubbish bins. Whereupon Ronnie kind of turned around and he said, "You shouldn't follow me, because I have no sense of direction whatsoever." And then he continued, "That is, of course, the mark of good anthropologist, no sense of direction." So maybe there's an allegory there, or maybe a warning. I'm going to leave that for you to decide. Now, the conference at that time, just a little tiny bit more on that, was history and ethnicity. So very relevant, actually, for this particular theme of the conference on utopia and temporalities. For me, there's a little bit of further personal biography entangled in that, in that the content of the conference was shaped by Elizabeth Tonkin, Marion MacDonald, and Malcolm Chapman, who then later edited that volume, that name. And all of those had studied with Edwin Ardner at Oxford, who was my doctoral supervisor at the time. Very sadly, that was Edwin's last conference because he died unexpectedly a few months later. But I wanted to just pay a little bit of homage to actually some really subtle thinking in that book. And partly what I wrote here was originally written in a sort of conversation with that, but that's ended up a little bit silent in the final version. Anyway, now I'll properly begin. So right now, in the centre of Berlin, a castle is nearing completion. It is surely a funny time to build a castle. Aren't castles from the olden days of jousting knights and multiple petty despots, from times when you needed to surround yourself with a moat and pull up the drawbridge to keep out the marauding hordes? Maybe it isn't so untimely after all. Maybe it is just the thing for the globally challenging future that faces us. Certainly, if we look around the world right now, there's lots of building of walls going on and aspiration to do so. There's battening down the hatches, securing the borders, severing connections, hunkering and bunkering down. Alongside bolstering the bunkering is a proliferation of rose-tinted looking back, waxing of romantic nostalgia for times imagined as more ordered, known, stable and secure, for times when people knew their place and stayed there, for times when it looked like everyday life could keep chugging along without irritating incursions of cultural difference or imminent catastrophe on the horizon. There's even a simmering wistfulness that seems to be gaining increasing traction for those dystopian utopia that nearly made it. If only Hitler hadn't taken things too far. If only those socialist totalitarian leaders hadn't been such personal hypocrites. If only imperialism and colonialism had managed to keep their fundamental decency. If only Britain had not so foolishly joined up with those continental foreigners, those Europeans. What a world we might be now in. What a world there could still be, perhaps. What potential the past holds for the future. Well, the official UN Global Challenges 2030 that this conference asks us to address don't list reactionary utopianism or xenophobic nostalgia. Actually, I was very good. I went and read these things. I thought we had to talk about them. Anyway, they and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals we speakers should consider don't mention the past, its deployment or effects at all. And that makes sense within the exclusively present and future temporal framing of these challenges and goals, with their emphasis on targets whose meeting or not it will be possible to assess. But actually that non-presence of the past and of history is also part of a disconnecting of the current situation with all of its histories and violence from what led to it. Sustainable development's temporality is one of clear-cut forward focus without even a glance back. But ignoring history doesn't make it go away or stop it from tripping up or meeting worthy and vital targets. Wars with roots in historic injustice and continuing grievances, as well as making great again nostalgic visions that promote viciously selective human hardship and ruinous environmental destruction, are just some of the most obvious ways in which the past or contemporary takes on it can interfere with sustainable development ambitions to head off climate catastrophe and, as mentioned in goal number 16, towards the end of the list, to foster more peaceful and inclusive societies. But contemporary deployments of the past aren't all or aren't necessarily damaging. There are, if not utopian possibilities, and here maybe recall that Thomas More's use of the term utopia plays with that homophone of you in the sense of good and you in the sense of no, so it's also no place, nowhere, kind of unattainable. So if not utopian possibilities to be found, there may be at least glimpses of hopeful potential. So the challenge is how to grapple with intimations and deployments of the past in ways that can at least be less damaging and that might even contribute to crafting more equitable and livable futures. So how then, this conference asks, are we as anthropologists to contribute to this? What can we bring to the challenge? Well, by now a lot has been said and lots very, very brilliantly. So we've already heard lots of instances about how ethnography can highlight the effects of imperial continuities, how we can also detect alternatives and other modes, perhaps, of operating. But what I want to point to, in addition, is the potential of working in new constellations, or maybe repurposed constellations of multiple expertise and engagement, and to possibilities, perhaps, of scaling up processes, of interjecting anthropology's insights into wider public domains. So the conference title expresses this in terms of perspectives. It asks, what perspectives can anthropology bring to bear? So alongside trying to offer a few examples from some current projects that I'm involved in, I also wanted to probe a bit at that idea of perspectives, and in a sort of semi-classical anthropological fashion, to try to do that via some reflections from fieldwork from the field. But because I think it might just get lost in the detail, I thought I'd say up front where I'm trying to get to with those points about perspectives. So, on the one hand, I want to argue that anthropology is a discipline that kind of deals in perspectives in some sense, that it's capable of detecting and articulating both in the sense of speaking out or speaking in other registers, but also in that sense of bringing together. So of articulating diverse ways of seeing and including, importantly, ways of seeing and experiencing that go under the radar of other disciplinary or especially maybe public policy ways of seeing. And in saying that, I don't just have in mind kind of radically other ideas of perspective as we get with De Castro's perspectivism or the kind of thing that can be kind of panned out into Descolat's very, very nice fourfold scheme, that both of those authors point to deeply ontologically diverse modes of apprehending the world or of worlding is undoubtedly deeply stimulating, and it's something we need to attend to and that, anthropologists are good at. But I want as well to keep hold of the idea of perspectives as sometimes entailing just little shifts in ways of seeing. And for anthropology, it's equally about quite subtle differences of perspective as well as more dramatic ones. So little shifts matter too. At the same time though, I want to a little bit, but not totally, trying to play a careful game here, I want a little bit to resist the idea of, or the assumption of perspectives as kind of free-floating add-ons that can be readily disconnectable and applicable elsewhere. So that model of transferability, it's widespread and maybe increasingly so. Sometimes it can be creatively deployed and insightful. So I don't want to fully rule it out, but it needs to be carefully curated, to use a term from my field. And too often I think anthropology kind of gets looks at as a kind of perspective prospecting, sort of looking for other angles, and especially radically other ones that can then just be transferred from one context to another. And what that then overlooks is anthropology's concern with locating perspectives, getting where people are coming from, and what's bound up with that. So I suppose it means, I've lost my place, it overlooks the histories and the hidden baggage and entailments. In other words, perhaps, what lies behind the facades. And that brings me to my castle story that I promised back in my title. So the castle being built in Berlin, so in German it's referred to as the Schloss, and I have to confess that I went for the translation of castle because it let me have this wordplay of castles in the air as a kind of utopia, so it seemed to work rather wonderfully. The truth is it's probably better translated in this context as palace. Right, there we are. Oops. So what you see here are the freshly built facades that are facades of a former palace in a realization that it's actually not, there was no single moment when it quite looked like that, because it refers particularly to it in its state in the 18th century and has lasted, but with various changes through until around 1950. So that palace is a reconstruction, but only partial, of a palace with a longer history back to the 15th century. And while the facades, as you can see them here, they're Baroque in style, and I guess they only looked new, maybe in the 1700s. It also will have a dome with a very contested cross by the time it's finished, and that was only added in the mid-19th century. And it's also not full reconstruction because there is also one side, the side that looks east or is looked at from the east, that is in rather unadorned modernist style. So the Schloss is then an architectural play of different time periods. It's also the site of various past and some present utopian visions. It was turned into the Baroque edifice that's now being resurrected under the monarchical and expansionist kingdom of Prussia, which achieved its utopian ambition to create a unified German nation in 1871. I'll show you a picture of of it as it then looked in 1920. Thereafter, the Schloss was the seat of the emperors of the German nation, and as such, in the late 19th and early 20th century, of German colonialism in China, New Guinea and Africa, and for earlier colonizing projects elsewhere, especially South America. In addition, though, and it has so many currents really, it was also a location for the contesting of that empire, most notably in November 1918, as part of the revolution that ended the monarchy and led to the establishment of the Weimar Republic. In World War II, the building was bombed, hit by bombing. Most agree that, given other buildings that were rebuilt and things, that it could have been restored at the time. But in the Russian zone of the divided Berlin, it wasn't. And then in 1950 and 1951, it was razed to the ground in what was seen as a dramatic symbolic statement of erasure of imperial history, in one form at least. So a denial of a certain heritage. On the site, the German Democratic Republic established its own governmental seat, the Palace of the Republic. Nothing, I think, really dates quite as much as futuristic utopian style. This was also a space of leisure for the country's citizens, with a bowling alley, a cinema, restaurants, milk bar that I recall visiting, and disco that I missed. So it was a very active statement at one level of social inclusion, actively counterpointed to that of the bourgeois Prussian palace, though perhaps those copper-tinted windows, opaque from the outside, give lie to some of that purported transparency. After the fall of the wall and German reunification, which saw Berlin become capital of the whole of Germany again, debate began about what to do in this part of Berlin, seen by many as the absolute symbolic centre, and therefore of the nation too. That symbolic centre was on account of the fact that the city palace, the Schloss, had been located there, as well as the new palace, but also that the surrounding area, which is called Museum Island, was especially heritage rich, with many grand museums, and it was given UNESCO World Heritage status in 1990. Like a scar on the face of an angel was how an eminent West German art historian who I heard talking about the GDR Palace described. Years of debate followed in which the government of the New Germany decided first one way, then the other, and coupled with various protests, artistic interventions, and so forth, decided in the end to dismantle the palace. And this occurred it was kind of slowly between 2007 and 2011, and was completed by them. For some, this was just the erasure of a pernicious totalitarian history. For others, it was an active forgetting of their heritage and even a denial of their perspective on that past. What then to build on the site was similarly contested, and to cut another quite complicated story short, what won out was a campaign by those who wanted to see the rebuilding of the Prussian palace. And here is an artist's impression. So Wilhelm von Bodin, a Hamburg businessman who led the campaign and put up some of his own cash to jumpstart public payment for the facades, he talks in interviews very emotionally about his own childhood memories of seeing the Schloss, first in its beautiful wholeness, and then very emotional terms, damaged and then no more. And many have joined him, supporting the project financially, though not the levels needed, but also through their keen interest in the details of the physical restoration. Although that went ahead, it didn't do so unopposed. Perspectives located in the site's past erupted into the present. Those who objected to the destruction of the palace and of the Palace of the Republic objected to the Schloss reconstruction, as did many commentators and local people who thought that looking back in that way just wasn't the right approach in the new Germany. What particularly loud, however, was opposition to the Schloss on account of its colonial entanglements, a development that knitted the local together with the wider near-global concern with the colonial that Anne Stoller pointed out in her opening keynote, and that Katie Gardner and Luke Heslop yesterday confirmed. So, I'm sorry, I don't know why that one's not so light. It's lighter on my screen. Anyway, this was then amplified by the decision that the building would house, among other things, objects and exhibitions from Berlin's Ethnological Museum, which is in effect Germany's national museum of ethnology or ethnography. So objects that might have been and somehow been acquired through colonial expropriation, but that could more generally be seen as gathered within European expansionist and grossly uneven power relations. So arguments legitimating the move, pointing out that some of the collections had originally been in the Schloss, only added fuel to the call for a moratorium on the whole building process. Now, by this stage, I'm sorry there's so much history, but it's picking bits out. By this stage, the cultural complex of museums and event spaces that it was to be housed within the Schloss have been named the Humboldt Forum, after the explorer and naturalist Alexander von Humboldt and his older brother Wilhelm, who was Berlin's education minister, as well as being a scholar of language diversity. Now, that naming and populating of the building with what were usually referred to in Germany as the non-European collections, which actually also included those from the Museum of Asian Art as well as the Ethnological, and both of those museums which were in the suburbs were shut down during the process, ready for things to go to the new Humboldt Forum. Although that naming was part of a stated ambition of the project to link together as much of the world as possible, it could be seen as well as part of a potentially problematic discourse of the world that's pervaded the project. So we see constant references in it to the world, and that has rather different potentialities. So on the one hand, it kind of gets used a bit like in world music and tending to refer to everything except for classical Europe. And on the other hand, it's sort of in tension with a more globally encompassing sense of the world. And those two different senses are in some ways bound up with really very different readings, especially of Alexander von Humboldt. On the one hand, as this kind of valiant European explorer, maybe the world's first eco-warrior, who tried to emphasize global connectivity in a way, including some environmentalists see as an interconnectivity that's vital to recover in light of the environmental challenge of the Anthropocene. On the other, as Mary Louise Pratt has most notably argued, he's seen as essentially a colonialist figure whose attempts to map and gain a global view are seen as part of a dangerous Eurocentric bid for world mastery. Now, next weekend is Alexander's 250th birthday, and there we have interesting commemorative stamp brought out for the occasion. And next weekend is when the Humboldt Forum was supposed to open. But Germany seems to be beset with all sorts of temporal challenges, and now it's going to be at least a year before it does so, which actually is really annoying for my research project, but I'll ignore that. So what we see then in this case of the Schloss and the Humboldt Forum is this site of many histories and possibilities coming together. And actually what it's really been in Germany is a catalyst for galvanizing debate about Germany's past, and especially about colonialism, provenance and restitution. Michael Rothberg has, as many people know, has argued that memories don't need to be mutually exclusive. They don't need to be part of a zero-sum game. But he talks of memory as multi-directional. So memories can spur each other on. They can proliferate and exist side by side in public space. And in some ways, more broadly, we do see precisely that, but not always. And in the end, surely, there's only so much space, and some heritage ends up getting more prominence than others. Well, part of what could be seen as an attempt to salvage the Humboldt Forum from its beginnings and rather conservative tendencies, one of the discourses that has emerged is that of multi-perspectivity. And a former PhD student of mine, the very brilliant Friedrich von Bose, or Fred as I will call him from now on, has analysed that for the early stages of the project, showing how in those early phases that idea of multi-perspectivity, which of course has been a very important one in certain areas of museum studies, how that became a key word for many of those who are arguing the case for why the non-European collections should enter the Humboldt Forum, and how that would mean that the Humboldt Forum would differ from traditional ethnographic museums. So claims were made, for example, that the Humboldt Forum would be unique in having, and I quote, a constant changing narrating position. But just how was much less clear. And what Fred's pointed out is that this kind of glorying in different positionalities tended to be disconnected from histories, especially, and I quote, histories of colonial exchange and entanglement, histories which lie at the heart of the modern project of ethnological collecting and exhibiting. As a result, he argues, the notion of multi-perspectivity becomes devoid of much of its possibly critical potential. Now, Fred has published on this in that book and also online back in 2013. That came out in 2016. And as such, his work could be easily read by some of those who've been busy designing the content of the Humboldt Forum. And indeed, Fred himself is now a curator of one part of the Humboldt Forum, a part that belongs to the Humboldt University, for which I too work. You can ask me about these things. At this point, let me say a little bit about the research project that took me to Berlin in 2015. And this project, which is talk about as a multi-researcher ethnography, in which this castle story that I talked about is part. Concerned not only with the Humboldt Forum, but more broadly with museum and heritage making of diverse kinds, with Berlin as kind of the focus, but we're interested in other places too, but our ethnographic focus is Berlin. We're especially concerned to look at the inclusions and exclusions and the models for performing those, techniques of differencing, skimming, and other forms of worlding. Some of us are directly doing fieldwork in the Humboldt Forum, and that includes me, and I've been hanging out especially with the team who are making an exhibition that is, if it stays with this name, has been called Berlin and the World, And that's an exhibition under the auspices of the city museums of Berlin and various staff from there. And it includes many people who have actually made their name already from doing very socially aware and critical museum practice. So I've ended up looking at the Humboldt Forum, at least partly through their critical vantage points, as they negotiate being part of the Humboldt Forum while trying to work against at least some of its grain. Now, I haven't got time to say much about that now, but I want to just give you one just tiny cameo of how I've benefited from their views, and in this case, their take on multi-perspectivity. So, on the one hand, what they did was they kind of embraced that as a keyword of the Humboldt Forum and saw it as congruent with their aims to tell a plural story of Berlin as made up of many peoples interconnected with many parts of the world in positive but also negative and sometimes deeply ambivalent ways. But they were also aware of the problems of the term, and that came to be expressed especially clearly when working with the designers on the exhibition about what are called the visual metaphors for the exhibition. At one stage, what the design suggested was a kaleidoscope as a sort of visual metaphor for this multi-perspectivity through the exhibition. So kaleidoscope, all those nice colours that constantly reform, with that reshuffling. It seemed like it had a lot to recommend it. But the curatorial team rejected it, as they already had, and you won't be so surprised, jungle and zoo, but we'll miss those. They rejected it because they felt it made the perspective seem just a matter of rather random ways of seeing, instead of more specific shapes resulting from particular histories and socio-political differences. So instead, after months of discussion, and it really did go on a long time, they opted for a metaphor, and this is actually one along the way and isn't the final one, but of a more multi-dimensional, three-dimensional web, and one that visitors will partly co-construct, adding their own perspectives. But they're still not totally satisfied with that, having struggled with how to translate the German term Verflechtung, which is less really about a kind of point-to-point connection, as if you draw lines, but has built into it, so it can be translated maybe more as something like a weaving. And so there've been lots of discussion how to translate it for the English version, in which actually some people here also in my team made comments, and you don't know this yet. They decided in the end to go for interconnection, even though that sort of sums up a little bit too much, maybe the point to point, but they felt that entanglement, which they knew the literature and were referring to that, just wasn't a term that would work for visitors, but they have this nice term Verflechtung in the German. Anyway, as you can see from this crazy list, I absolutely love this. These are projects, the sub-projects in this project that I'm leading in Berlin, this Making Differences project. And you can see that it's impossible to read, I know, but you can see hopefully that there's lots of quite varied work going on. And that is both purposeful and a little bit contingent at the same time. So most of the researchers have been trained at least some extent in anthropology, though we have quite a lot of different anthropologies there with various degrees of archival training, and we also have some particular expertise in visual anthropology and art. And although I don't want to romanticize a sort of anartistic perspective, the alertness, I think, to the visual and sometimes other forms of the sensory that researchers trained in those traditions bring absolutely undoubtedly enriches our multiple and constantly mutually engaged and reformulating perspectives. So, although only some of these directly work on the Humboldt Forum, others impinge on it, or it on them, in various ways. So what we can kind of say is that what we're doing is what in Germany gets called looking quer, and quer means kind of obliquely or askance, and I think we could say queerly as well at it. And if I just pick out two of the team members here, who are here, who are doing this. So Jonas Tinius, who has been looking at smaller alternative galleries, which sometimes characterize their approach against the Humboldt Forum, and who are often very concerned with finding new positions, perhaps deploying art for thinking difference in other ways. And Magdalena Bucic, she's working at the Museum of European Cultures, a museum that ended up excluded from the Humboldt Forum developments. Left behind is how it's often talked. And what her exploration of the collection shows is that her exploration of collections that tend to be forgotten in the contemporary post-colonial focus shows is histories and connections with other parts of the world, and stories and worldings that might also be brought to the centre, but haven't, at least not yet. And I should say that we also have other researchers in our centre working not formally on this project, but who enrich it in other ways. Hello, Alisa, at that point. Let me then, in very short time, no, I won't say short, shortish time remaining, mention a couple of examples of work that actually will result directly in some displays in the Humboldt Forum itself. And I have to say this was not something that was planned at the beginning of the project, and I work in a context where we're deliciously free of having to do impact. So this is no impact case study. This has just emerged out of the work and things that seemed like a good idea because they did, which is a luxury. So one of these is a project that's really right at the beginning called Who is ID 8470. And that's led by one of our researchers called Tal Adler, who always introduces himself as an artist. And this is work that will go into the hub, the university's area of the Humboldt Forum. And that idea has been developed in close collaboration with Friedrich von Boser, among others. It also draws on a model of work that Tal devised for a European Horizon 2020 project that we finished recently, a project called Traces. And I put up its website if you want to have a look at it. That had at its heart a kind of idea of, well, looking at contentious or difficult heritage, but doing so, trying to get away from that model where artists come along and they're supposed to make an intervention. They come in, make the intervention, and go. What this did, and this is the co-production there and what we call creative co-productions in the project, they entailed cultural institutions and artists and ethnographers working together in teams on specific problems and developing particular products or ways of dealing with things. It was a project, again, we didn't know what those would be at the beginning, so sometimes they were exhibitions, sometimes they were databases and so on. So, so that was part of the background to developing this particular project, and it did draw especially on a part of that Traces project called Dead Images, which had to do with human skull collections in the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and I can talk more about that project if you like. But what this one will do is it begins with a skull of unknown origin, at least unknown at the moment, and we'll find out from research whether how far we can get with it. It's part of the university collections, and it's one of these, as you can see, skulls with drawings on from Francis Gall's theory of organology, which later came to be known as phrenology. Now, one of the things that came up in the Traces project was questions which partly came from working with various indigenous communities about showing skulls. And so as Tal already thinks he probably will not actually show the skull, which also opens up some very interesting ways of thinking about questions of perspective and where they're focusing on. But for that reason, I covered it here as well. So the idea will be to work with that skull and really see the range of different stories that might be brought to bear upon it, ranging from racial, scientific histories and others. See where it goes. The work will also involve those who Erica Lehrer, who is part of our Traces project, calls communities of implication, a more expansive term than that source community term that's so often used. So in that way, there will be a kind of conscious deployment of multi-perspectival, but heeding the warnings from Fred's own critical analysis and from the Traces project. So the aim will not be to be kaleidoscopic, but a more curated, historyful, and implicated plurality. Right, one quick other project here. So, so this project, give it its full title here, so Confronting Colonial Pasts, Envisioning Creative Futures, is a project that's currently in the making. And what its origins are were actually from a proposal that was made at a research workshop that we held in Berlin, where we brought together researchers, our researchers, some other researchers from various countries, some of you here I think, and also museum and heritage professionals, mainly from Berlin, but also elsewhere. And actually I'll go forwards and backwards. An idea that was expressed at that conference, and I know there's too much text to read, but you can go and download, free from our website, the booklet that we produced about the workshop. So Larissa Förster, who is one of our researchers and who has been working on questions of colonial provenance in Germany for a long time, and she's been very active as well in doing things like contributing to the writing of the guidelines for the German Museum Association on objects in their collections. She's actually just left our project to actually head up a new section of the German Lost Art Foundation, which is something that was set up particularly to trace art that had been looted by the Nazis, but she's setting up a new section in Berlin on colonial provenance, and we'll continue to work closely with her. And that again is an example of a kind of fluid relationship. We never knew things would go that way, but that's how it's going. But anyway, the core of her proposal was to set objects free. And she asks there, so what if we set objects free as a methodology? Now, her suggestion fell onto open ears of particularly one curator from the Ethnological Museum, Jonathan Fine, who was present at our workshop, and who was already engaged in questions of colonial provenance of the objects and in discussion with various African museums. So he's the curator, one of the curators for Africa, and especially a program called Africa Accession. But the project has now begun, and it's got funding from the Gerd Henkel Stiftung, Gerda Henkel Stiftung. And what it's entailed is a group of what they call in their terminology, a group of stakeholders from various communities of implication and also from the National Museum of Namibia who've come to Berlin, and they've selected about 20 objects, and there's a few of them, and then taken them to the National Museum National Museum of Namibia, where they're undergoing conservation work. I have to tell you, these things often, there are twists along the way, and one of them here that sort of complicated the process is that these are really pretty poisonous. And the reason they're poisonous is because of all the conservation materials that have been used on them, and that is the case for very, very many objects in museum collections. So what will happen with them is they'll go to Namibia with conservation experts, and there'll be training in conservation techniques, which is something the National Museum wanted, as part of the process. What then happens, and apparently you can remove some, but you're always going to need masks and gloves to work with them. What then happens is that these objects, and they're mostly textiles and jewellery, is that artists in Namibia will work with those, and they're going to produce some new objects, and those objects will go into a new National Museum of Fashion that's currently being built in Namibia. And then, at least some exhibition about this and some artwork, and it's already decided that a particular piece that refers to the remembrance of German colonial violence and destruction will come back into a future display in the Humboldt Forum. So, there's a couple of ongoing projects. Both of these projects then are ones that kind of gathered their own momentum and in various ways have seen unanticipated twists and turns, and there may be more to come. They're a methodology, a recursive one, to use a term that Jonas Tinius and I have used in a recent paper in a volume called The Anthropologist, as curator, that's due out sometime or other soon, I think. Both projects are likely to be criticised for not doing enough, and even for participating at all in the tainted Humboldt Forum. They're not a storming of the castle walls or a tearing down of the castle. All the same, I think, they're minor but not insignificant insurgencies. They grasp a chance to unsettle existing perspectives and practice, and to bring other ways of seeing and doing into what will be a much visited public space. A couple of final comments. On perspectives and multi-perspectivity, I've tried to argue for modes of engaging different positions, but without flattening them out or kaleidoscoping them into merely colourful patterns. That deeper, more engaged perspectival plurality, anthropology is basically brilliant at that. I think it's the core of what we do. And the world and the future need our expertise in detecting and articulating diverse perspectives, and including sometimes quite subtle shifts of position. At the same time, though, and in the face of the disturbing and relentless developments that I mentioned at the beginning, and that have been mentioned in all our previous keynotes and plenaries and many panels too, in the face of those, we need as many thoughtful and creative hands on deck as possible, and we need new and repurposed methodologies to grasp the opportunities available to unsettle pernicious ways of seeing and doing, and to meet the global challenge of ensuring that there will be a future, hopefully an equitable, livable and creative one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was lovely, a wide-ranging exposition on the multiple perspectives that will be emerging, or are emerging and will be emerging at the Humboldt Forum. So there's a whole range of subjects that have been raised here on methodology, anthropological methodology, on curation, insurgencies, and other ways of seeing. It reminds me of what perhaps is a defining characteristic of the museum or the archive in general, namely that it is a utopian space. An archive is, of course, never complete. It's always in the process of being made. And of course, the process of decolonization in that is one of the most recent iterations of the tasks that one could set for this archive. Maybe you would like to ask some questions. Sharon is ready to answer your questions. There's a question over there at the back.
Hello. So in your talk, you spoke mostly about confronting the colonial legacy of these collections, but I was wondering, what about the absence or erasure of the Palace of the Republic in the GDR? Because I work in Eastern Germany, and that's something that figures really prominently in narrative of Eastern Germans about their own erasure from the, let's say, national body of history. So I was wondering whether these research projects, there is any space for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely part of the story, and so one of the things, and particularly from within the Berlin exhibition that I've been looking at, has been about that question of, where the GDR figures in what will be presented. There is a whole warehouse of all the stuff out of the Palace of the Republic in Berlin. So there's also very interesting questions about what you decide to get out of that particular physical archive and bin. So yeah, it is something that we're looking at, and I think actually Magda's research, not particularly the Palace of the Republic, but the questions of GDR history, and it's it's not, to say sidelined is the wrong term, but where it manages to emerge and not is definitely one of part of the story. And in that turning of the space into one primarily with the non-European collections at that point, that was seen very much as a removal of the space of that history. And it was in the plans at that point restricted to a sort of little basement area about the history of the space. That's kind of changed a bit, and there is reference to the Palace of the Republic and so on in the Berlin exhibition. A little bit remains to be seen how much of that is there.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I have two questions, really. One is to do with the relationship of the development of this project with other grand museum complexes around the world, and to what extent they fed off that. Because I know Neil MacGregor was involved in this to some extent, and the title was the world at home in the heart of Berlin, and Museum for the World of the World, the British Museum sort of logo, although that's going to be dumped soon, I hear. So that's one issue. To what extent the conditions for the development of this project were actually global at that level, Second question is if you could reflect on some of the anxieties perhaps of the curators involved in this, past and present, who have had basically told to get on with it, and to what extent the tensions there between the management project side and the curators on the ground, to what extent have they had or have had any influence in how this has been developed as a project?
That's a big question. Beginning with the first one, yeah, it was the first development of the project was very, very much looking to certain key museums, and documents were produced which were talking about, especially Quai Branly. That became a real, I mean, I think at first there was an idea that could simply be emulated in Berlin, but there's a document that kind of also refers to all the big museum projects around the world and says, next one, Berlin, Humboldt Forum. So that was very much part of it, and when Neil McGregor was brought in, to use the language that's usually used, to head up the founding directorship of the Humboldt Forum at that point, that was also seen as, as part of this global networking and acquisition of global expertise for the Humboldt Forum, and the discourse of world permeates in all kinds of ways, and that was definitely entangled in it. The issue of the curators and relationships with management and so on, I have to say here that the Humboldt Forum, I sometimes say it's Humboldt Forum soup. It's got so many ingredients, and so it's not like a museum. So it has a whole set of different governmental agencies for different parts. So the Berlin exhibition that I look at, that's under the City of Berlin government structure. The Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art are under something called the State Museums of Berlin and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, which is a national organization, even though it has the term Prussian, or because it does, sort of. So it depends. I suspect you really mean the Ethnological Museum, which is what anthropologists mostly are interested in. The curators often find themselves being criticized, and there's been a lot of different phases in the procedure, and there's been turnover of people as well. So it's really, really difficult to just say one thing there. And there have been different struggles within, and but with also what. Let me think. Am I being filmed? Yeah, maybe. I mean, just can you be a bit careful here. Let me think how to say this.
It's not that sort of question.
No, I mean,
it's a structural question of how curators have been able to deal with the histories, because they know the histories of their collections and the problems with them.
Partly. And so developments like that one that I mentioned at the end, in some ways that was a curator grasping a possibility to do some of the kind of work that, and enough people to support that, that he had kind of wanted to do. It gave a sort of voice to that. And I think there's quite a lot of examples of that. But some of it has been a little bit running to catch up, because I think that the critique of it was experienced as unexpected in some ways by the curators. And curators who thought they were doing a very good thing found themselves feeling often very attacked and so on. So that's been part of the context. But you can wait for the Ethnological Museum, you can wait for Margarete von Oswald's ethnography down at the bottom there of the museum. She really was absolutely embedded there in the museum in some of the most difficult times of its development.
Hang on, there's a question at the back, left. Yes.
Hi.
Sharon,
Hi,
thank you.
Jeanette.
Am I on?
I can hear you.
Sharon, thank you for that. It's really, and thank you for putting that slide back up, because it's really wonderful hearing about the massive diversity within this project that is all being somehow hung together, and really how exciting it is. But I wanted to ask you whether you could say a little bit more about this multi-perspectival approach. So you've already talked about, the kind of, it's not a radical alterity ontological position, neither is it a kaleidoscope of perspectives. And I really like this idea of like very small shifts that make a different perspective. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that overarching concept, basically.
Yeah, I suppose doing kind of two things. One is looking at it in the field as it manifests itself, and where I suppose the term is done in a problematic way. And then at the same time wanting to recover a version of it where there is an openness to a plurality of perspectives, but without chopping them off from particularly what's formed them and so on. So I suppose if I'm thinking about something like how would you manifest that through an exhibition, like if it's the with this one, and in this one, because we're kind of working with that as an idea, we want as well. So sometimes what happens in musical ways of thinking about it is a kind of idea of a stable object as well, that you just poking different perspectives at, kind of. And so we want to, because we remove the object, in this case, it'll be a sort of absent presence, is to really, in some ways, really think about what it means to bring different views together. But I suppose one of the points where it gets, when you are putting in the questions of the history and the locatedness, is then, what legitimacy are you giving to different ones? And one of the potential problems with multi-perspectivity is that it pretends a sort of universal, any views, and it flattens them to the same, and that can be political as well. And how you deal with curating that, I think, is a problem, really. And in some ways, it's a bit like the old cultural relativism problems for anthropology there, and there have been in this work questions about, okay, what about very objectionable perspectives? Are we going to include those as well? So I guess the argument I'm wanting to get to is for recognizing the plurality but locating it, and that as well can entail evaluation of which are closing off the perspectives and which are allowing those to be expressed as well. I don't know if that gets anywhere to what you want.
Thank you, Sharon. That was such a wonderfully interesting thing. I'm going to get another question that's going to just ask you to talk a bit more about something. But as you know, my son's a museum curator. He complains all the time that curators have become an inconvenience because they know things, and complains bitterly about all the mediators. But I'd like to ask you about the mediations that transmit these controversies and critiques into this field of action. I mean, where exactly are they coming from, and how they get transmitted through, which I imagine is quite a complicated managerial structure, to to then get debated presumably by the curators themselves, in part at any rate. So I mean, how exactly does that work as a kind of politics?
I think what our research has definitely showed is it works really differently in some of the different locations. So speaking for the Berlin exhibition, they really debate the stuff. They bring the debates in, they might have the things that have come out in the news and so on. They bring in diversity training experts to talk to them, to discuss. So they really grasp it from wherever, and that's partly why I think they quite liked having an anthropologist hang out as well. So they were very, very keen to, find out what are the, partly many of them knew already because they attend conferences on critical museology and also going on visits to places and evaluating those. That was very much part of the process as well. Other parts, and I think it is something that makes a difference between them, so because we're looking at quite a lot of different locations, that simply doesn't happen, anything like that ever. And there is a sort of traditional model of curators as their own, having their own fiefdoms, and they just do their thing. And some of them may be going to conferences and reading about things, but they might also not do so. So that is an area that, there is a lot of variety.
In black, the person in black.
Hi Sharon, thanks so much for your talk. It's obviously a really complex project that engages with so many different nodes of bureaucratic structure, but also kind of so much contested politics, and I think some of the questions already touched on that. I'd just like to ask you, perhaps if you could expand a little bit more about the Ccb model that is part of the project, this creative co-production, and how such work, and this is actually the slide right here, isn't it? How such work perhaps addresses some of these difficulties, some of these questions, and how perhaps it brings something to your project which, if your project was not configured in this way, it might not be able to address.
Yeah, so this was really at the heart of this other project that, they have big intersections. Thinking what to say about it. Just to give a little bit of background, so it's one of these European projects, so numerous partners in different countries, and it worked from, it had a very diverse set of contentious heritages. So Tal, as part of a team, looked at this collection that's actually more than 40,000 human skulls in the Natural History Museum in Vienna, and there's also a great photo library, and the museum really didn't know what to do with that. We also had Slovenian death masks, artworks produced by non-Jewish Poles about the Holocaust, which are in Krakow Museum, an abandoned synagogue in Transylvania, and so on, as cases. And so the idea was that in this, that it would be a kind of more sustainable working, and there would be a kind of attempt, not just of the artist goes in and leaves, or you just work for. On the one hand, there was close working on a particular problem and so on, but the idea was also to create some more sustainable change in those organizations because of people, the idea that people would really appreciate the ways of working, and that the ethnographers there would also be doing this kind of work of making explicit of what was going on in the process. And in some cases, I think it worked really well. I was really stunned by a conference where, with the Dead Images, the Skulls project, where biological anthropologists from the museum just talked about how they really had totally changed their practice because they had not seen, I mean, they had seen themselves as working with specimens, and actually because the project also brought them together with some Maori representatives and Native American ones, and that experience of so how that project worked really made the biological anthropologists feel they needed to treat their collections in different ways. So it seemed to be a model that opened up, a new kinds of possibilities. Sometimes it didn't work, but that was pretty interesting too. Yeah. And I think the thing that you were creating something new as well. So there was, because it's a new project, you got to come out with some sort of public something, even if it wasn't determined what. And but that sort of gave it a focus and it worked in that way.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's really inspiring because I also think about the word object, and to think about an anthropology of the contemporary, I was just wondering, it's very fascinating, but I don't want to reduce the concept object to the material. And as much as we are now reinventing or rethinking the idea or the concept of the archive, I'm just wondering, in the contemporary world, what is it that we do not need to archive? Is there something that we don't have to archive? Can there be a movement against anti-archiving? Why I ask this is sort of specific, because 5 days ago, in a place where I come from, 1.9 million citizens have become stateless overnight because they couldn't prove their identity through a document. That the state wanted a document and an evidence of relation to a document in 1951 or 71, right? But when you recognize 1.9 million people as also having been a citizen, and what is the status now, because they cannot prove their citizenship through an archive. So as much as the material points to the idea of a location, and that is multi-perspectival, of course, we recognize that, the material also is indexical of something. And I think the notion of an index in the contemporary is changing. So I'm just wondering, we recognize the making an archive is continuous, and it should be that, do we not need to archive something? Just to invite your comment on that.
So in that, I guess I hear the question about, what happens if something isn't archived, but also, I'm probably reading this into your question. But another project that I didn't mention because I suffered from its effects is within an AHRC project that's finished this year. It's been a bit of a mad year, called Heritage Futures, and I was leading this part of it called Profusion, where basically the kind of question was, where do you stop? What do you not archive? And we were looking there at particularly museums of everyday life, so in the UK, especially small, localish museums, and what they decided to keep for the future. But we also looked at people's own homes, about their ideas about what do they keep. And although we didn't mean to, the project just kept turning into how do people get rid of stuff? How do they put it in these out-of-town storage centres? And we found museums are pretty much doing that. Museums are really bothered now about, is it okay to sell stuff off, or they quite like sometimes the idea of it being repurposed for recycling and so on. So the question of, what can we not archive, I think is a massive question of our times in all sorts of ways, because there is an idea that maybe we should keep everything. And the digital, I think, gives us the sense that that's possible, even though actually digital stuff is usually the first to not not survive. But you raised this other question, though, actually sometimes really, serious side effects of what doesn't get archived, which was in a way what pushes towards then this archiving. But it doesn't need to. The object you asked about as well. I mean in.
Object is non-material.
I mean it can be. I mean if we look at heritage as a phenomenon, intangible cultural heritage has become increasingly at the sort of centre of the gaze. So it doesn't need to be the object, but there needs to be some kind of trace, of course.
I think we have time for one more question. And there's Emma. Does someone want to leave?
Thank you, Sharon, for that marvellous presentation, very thought-provoking. I wanted to just refer back to a couple of the earlier questions and see if I could ask you to try to stitch them together. Not knowing anything about this part of the world, I was visiting somewhere near Warsaw about 5 years ago and was shown a place in this village where the Grand Synagogue had been, and was told by the local residents how where I was standing in the middle of a road had been where the synagogue was, and that this was a predominant practice, not only the raising of buildings, but then the replacement of something else there, so you would never know it had been there. And it struck me when you were describing the dual sort of destruction and recreation of the Schloss that there was something familiar in those acts. So what I was wondering about is when you talk of multi-perspectives, whether there isn't also some sort of a problem of scale as well, because it seems to me that all the wonderful projects you described are essentially trying to look at the curation, so they're about the contents of these collections. But there's something also going on in terms of the spatial history of the structures in which these collections are contained, which perhaps disappears in turn too, because it's not made up of those material artifacts, whether or not they're co-created. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that at all.
So just thinking the direction. No, thanks very much for that. I think, the scale of it. So I think one thing that's really interesting is which become the ones that are selected for retention and which are not. So many things just kind of do get vanished, if you like. And I mean, in the case of Poland, there's been a really interesting project of trying to rediscover the traces of all sorts of Jewish presence by Jonathan Weber, and he set up a whole museum in Krakow about this and of the Galician Jews, and that's very, very, very interesting, really, really poignant case. So, I mean, in this, I think in Germany mostly there's a lot of attentiveness to these questions, precisely because of the histories of erasure. Having said that, things do still get vanished, but they're much less likely to. So I suppose there's different moments and different cases. In some ways I could probably answer that better thinking about some of my earlier work on Nazi sites and what remained and when, and you really have very different approaches at different times to those very, very questions. And just, whether you try to retain things just in photographic form or the physical structures and so on, which is maybe what you mean by scale. And there's very interesting issues there as well about the kinds of materiality and which things decay faster, in what kinds of ways as well, and also transportability of photos. You can move and store elsewhere. The spaces are just, where they were.
So thank you, Sharon, for this fascinating lecture on actually a work in progress. And so we get a view of how in the museum new futures are being crafted in Germany, which is quite a privilege, I think, to be part of. So
You can come and visit it when it opens.
Okay. Yeah. Tell us when it's open. So it's before I ask an applause for Sharon, can I just mention that Emma is going to have some more housekeeping notes for you, and yeah.
Yep, thank you so much, Sharon. That was wonderful. This is my final reminder, I promise you, to celebrate this wonderful lecture. We have fine dining and fine dancing. Those of you who are going to the dinner, and those of you who want to go to the alternative venues, or if you just want to go into the city to eat, the buses are leaving at 6:30, so you do have time to go and freshen up a bit, stretch, get your dancing shoes on. And the place that the buses will be is outside the drama studio, which is between number 11 and I think it's 14 on your map. But just basically follow the crowd and look out for the volunteers. Okay, so see you all tonight.
So, can I ask you to once more thank Sharon?